this side of the House has ever said that any Guyanese citizen is a bloodsucker, and so I would ask the honourable member to withdraw that statement. Guy Suko is not a citizen of this country.
Honourable member, I don't see that as a point of order. There are.
Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I am convinced that the members of the PPP have perfected the art of theatrics. Based on the opening statement by the Honorable Minister of Education, I am convinced that theatrics is what guides the PPP when they come into this Honorable House, Mr. Speaker. It is shocking that the Honorable Minister would have stood up in her opening statement and make remarks as though the PPP members of Parliament comes to this House and acts with decorum. And persons listening to this broadcast will not understand the level of vulgarity that comes to this House through the members of the PPPC, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, to the Honorable Minister of Education, she is not a preposition, she is a pronoun. Mr. Speaker, the comments made by the Honorable Minister of Education was well put together, like I said, very theatrical. And I can tell you that it was almost convincing. But there was one small thing that could not be dismantled, Mr. Speaker. It could not have been dismantled that the fact that in 2019, Guyana saw the best ever CSEC results under the APNU-AFC coalition, under the stewardship of Dr. Nicolette Henry. That cannot be erased, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, persons can come here and they can repeatedly speak of who can and cannot do, but the results cannot lie, Mr. Speaker. And that is what we need to remember here today. The President of the United States, Joe Biden, once said, "Do not tell me what you value. Show me your budget, and I will tell you what you value." Mr. Speaker, this budget clearly shows what the PPP values, and more clearly it shows what the PPP could not care less about. There is nothing in this budget for public servants. Absolutely nothing. No salary increases, no bonuses. The PPP have no value for public servants. There is nothing in this budget to benefit the working people of Guyana. No adjustments in income tax, you would know what that is. No attempt to minimize for the minimum wage to be adjusted, Mr. Speaker. No increase in the income tax threshold, Mr. Speaker. This is where it matters. This is where you show that you value the people of this country. No housing subsidies, Mr. Speaker. No debt relief, Mr. Speaker. The PPP have no value for the working people of this country, Mr. Speaker. There is no plan for higher education in this budget. Copying the policies of the APNU-AFC, the PPP promised the Guyanese people free university education. What in this budget brings us closer to this promise? What in this budget drives us to believe that you are on a pathway to actually creating a system so that we will have higher, freer university education? There is absolutely nothing in this budget that brings us one step closer to free university education, and these are the facts. To say, I find it hilarious actually that the PPP would come to this house and look Guyanese in the face and say, "Oh, we promised free education in 5 years." Do you believe that the Guyanese people are so gullible that you can stand here in this house and say to them, oh, it is within the next 5 years? You are simply saying, Mr. Speaker, what the PPP is simply saying is that they have presented a campaign promise for 2025 today. That is what they're saying by saying in the next 5 years. It is unacceptable. We cannot be so gullible. With nothing to benefit the working people of Guyana in this budget, sir, the PPP now attempts to parade around the failure and pretend that they are successes. Mr. Speaker, the PPP comes with some illogical source of confidence to proudly proclaim that is their hope and ambition to deliver non-oil GDP in 2021 that will be smaller than that of non-oil GDP that was under the coalition in 2019, Mr. Speaker. This is GDP facts. This is what was presented in the budget that was presented in this House, Mr. Speaker. This is a shameless admittance of complete failure by the PPP, Mr. Speaker. As stewards of the Caribbean's largest oil producer, the PPP has the audacity to beat their chest and boast about the ambition to deliver 3 years of economic stagnation, because that is what they presented to us. Self-respecting statesmen and women would resign in shame of such failure, Mr. Speaker. Or was the APNU-AFC's accomplishment in building a strong economy in 2019 so overwhelming that the PPP will now have to take 3 years to accomplish such a GDP growth, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, this budget speaks to paying a lot and getting little to nothing in return. As Warren Buffett says, price is what you pay, value is what you get. With the working man and woman getting no value from this budget, it would be fair to expect that they will be asked to pay nothing. But instead, the PPP has laid before us a plan to deliver not only the worst 3 years of economic growth since the first term of the Jagdeo administration almost 20 years ago, but they intend to deliver economic stagnation hand in hand with the worst level of borrowing ever seen in this nation's history, Mr. Speaker. This same PPP who campaigned boldly all over internet, social media, newspapers of the 80 billion overdraft in 5 years has in half a year ramped up the budgetary overdraft of over 90 billion with plans to reach almost 200 billion in 1.5 years. Over almost 200 billion in 1.5 years, Mr. Speaker. That is what the PPP has presented to this honorable House and to the Guyanese people. Mr. Speaker, let me put this into context for you. In my 2020 budget presentation to this very House a few months ago, I stated that, and I quote, the 2012 census reported that there was a total of 210,124 households. This budget speaks to borrowing 75 billion. To further break that down, each household will now be burdened with the national debt increase of $357,000 per household in a single budget to further enrich the wealthy, unquote. Mr. Speaker, if that wasn't bad enough, if that was not bad enough, a few months ago, Mr. Speaker, the Honorable Senior Minister within the Office of the President with responsibility for finance would then come to this House and present a report for 2020 showing revenues, income, of $227 billion and $325 billion in spending, $98 billion in budgetary overreach that has to be financed from one debt or another, a debt burden of $466,000 now rests on the shoulders of every Guyanese family, Mr. Speaker. And what do we have to show for this? We have absolutely nothing to show for this except the burdens being placed on the shoulders of our upcoming generation, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the PPP is now trying to deceive the Guyanese people with false promises that this borrowing is being used to cover tax cuts that would lower their cost of living. That is what was said in this House. Mr. Speaker, it's either the PPP has completely skipped Economics 101 class or they are deliberately intending to make fools of the Guyanese people. Because the upward stickiness of prices is a basic economic principle that one would expect any student of economics to understand and any policymakers that sits on the other side of this House, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this economic principle was proven to be true when the senior minister within the office of the president with responsibility for finance stood in this House with pride and declared that the cost of the average consumer bundle of goods and services increased by 1.2%. Mr. Speaker, to clarify my point, the Honorable Finance Minister stood right here in this House and said the cost of living today is higher than it was under the AP and UAFC coalition. This leaves the question, Mr. Speaker, if the cost of living is higher, then with no salary increases, mind you, and no reduction in PAY, these are the real things that you do when you care about the people as they are being professed every day, to put money in their pockets, then where did the $466,000 borrowed on behalf of each Guyanese family go, Mr. Speaker? Because we know it certainly did not go into the small man's pocket. It did not go there. We that represent the will of the Guyanese people, I want to say this thing first. The PPP claimed that they consulted with Guyanese in the preparation for this budget. But I can tell you this, Mr. Speaker, the PPP did not consult with Guyanese people when they were formulating this budget. And for all those, and this is a message to every single one of the members of the PPP, for all those who stood up here and tried to justify the non-inclusion of the opposition in the budget consultation process should never utter the word democracy in this honorable House, for it shows full dictatorial tendencies to try to demand that constitutional office holders must bend the knee to the will of the PPP in an effort to be included in any decision making for persons that they represent, elected members in this House, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the PPP cannot speak to me about democracy as if they hold a monopoly on the concept. And yes, I can speak of constitutionality, Mr. Speaker, and no member of the PPP should ever speak of constitutionality. Because they are currently squatting in office through an unconstitutional process, Mr. Speaker. How dare you come to this House and speak of constitutionality when the process that brought you to this House was unconstitutional? How shameful is that? So when the PPP comes to this House and speak of democracy and constitutionality, we must all have a good laugh. Because it can only be considered a mockery in this House to come and speak of democracy while practicing dictatorship. It can only be considered a mockery in this House to come and speak of the Constitution when the Constitution was not used for the PPP to gain office. Mr. Speaker, the Guyanese people were not consulted in formulating this budget. The people who are left with the burden of repaying the debt created by this budget, sir, was not consulted. Not once were they ever asked what they wanted. And we, the members of the APNU AFC, knows that they were not consulted, because we, the members of the APNU AFC, represent more than half of the population in Guyana, Mr. Speaker. So we know that you did not consult with these people. Mr. Speaker, the PPP further boasts that they consulted with small parties. The PPP further boasts that they consulted with small parties. Mr. Speaker, the smallest child in Guyana knows that those parties functioned as subsets of the PPP in the last elections, Mr. Speaker. In the very recount that they keep talking about in here day after day, presenter after presenter, the PPP agents were used to sit into stations because these small parties could not even muster representation to sit in these recount stations in this very compound, Mr. Speaker. Do not speak to us about the recount process as though we don't know what it entails. Mr. Speaker, is it a joke that the PPP think that they can look Guyanese in the eyes and tell them, oh, we consulted with the people who you did not vote for, so this budget is all well and good? It is a mockery. This is the biggest insult to the Guyanese people. Political subsets of the PPP who enter the political arena and who were all pronounced dead on arrival by the Guyanese voters must not be the basis of consultation for the Guyanese people, Mr. Speaker. Not one of them, not one of the persons that the PPP claims that they consulted with could claim a seat in this honorable House, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Honorable Deputy Speaker of this House is here today after combining three parties' list of votes. And even then, Mr. Speaker, even then, it was not enough to mount up to the required amount of votes for a seat in this House. And he came into this House on the difference of vote, Mr. Speaker. So how dare the PPP use those small parties as a basis of consultation when they speak in totality of the Guyanese people, Mr. Speaker? It will not be accepted at any point in time. Mr. Speaker, the PPP only consulted with those who have been rejected by the Guyanese people. Is this the democracy that they speak about? None of them can speak of democracy. No one in the PPP can come to this House and tell me about democracy, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the members of the PPP stood in this House, one after the other, and speak about election 2020. I have listened to the PPP members speak day after day, and I must respond to the fallacy that the PPP is trying to portray in this House, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Honorable Minister of Agriculture stood in this House yesterday. He spoke of the budget. He spoke of this building, rather, being monumental. And this building is monumental, Mr. Speaker. I spent 1 month in this very doom during the recount. I spent 1 month sitting right there where Mr. Ramjatan is sitting, Mr. Speaker. And I can tell you that the reference that the minister was making, he fell short in speaking about the loud cries that came from the members representing the PPP at that recount when they were adamant that the observation report should not be read out to the Guyanese people. They did not want the Guyanese people to know what was uncovered in those boxes, Mr. Speaker. So how dare them come to this house and pretend that they are unrighteous, Mr. Speaker. We will not accept that. It has to be answered and will be answered right here, right now, today. Speaker after speaker, day after day, they came here and they keep talking about democracy and constitutionality as though they have some monopoly on the concept, and we will not allow it to go forward like that, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker,
Honorable member, I think it's Mr. Jordan. Please, if you want to shout, we have a large compound and you can exercise your lungs. You get back your time, honorable member. Please,
Thank you.
continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the PPP comes to this house and speak as though, Mr. Speaker, they speak as though any of what was proven, any of what was uncovered, rather, during the recount was ever proven untrue. Mr. Speaker, let me tell the Guyanese people that not one of the fraud uncovered in those boxes were ever proven untrue, and the PPP have to live with that fact. Mr. Speaker, if the PPP believe that there was so much wrong about the 2020 election, then I suggest each and every one of them on that side of the house grab a piece of paper and start writing your resignation, because you all are sitting in here on questionable votes in the 2020 election. So do not come and speak here as though you are self-righteous in this process. Mr. Speaker, if the PPP should have been happy, if the PPP would have thought for 1 second that these claims of fraud was untrue, then I believe that they should have been happy to allow Petition 88 to go through, when there would have been proven to the Guyanese people that all of these claims that was made by the coalition was not so. But instead, Mr. Speaker, the PPP decided to do every single thing in their power, Mr. Speaker, to make sure that election petition 88 does not go through, because they knew, Mr. Speaker, that they would have been exposed and the Guyanese people would have known the truth, Mr. Speaker. The PPP have no grounds to speak of democracy. Mr. Speaker, I will not be lectured by any member of the PPP on democracy when every aspect of their governance in the last few months is laced with dictatorship. Mr. Speaker, what more proof do we need of dictatorial tendencies when the gates of this very precinct were closed and elected members of parliament were restricted free movement? The PPP cannot speak to me or any other Guyanese about democracy, Mr. Speaker. The PPP is a perfect representation of the phrase, do as I say, but not as I do. But this is not pre-2015, sir. This is 2021, and the people of this great nation are not starved of information as they were before, Mr. Speaker. And Guyana will rise again, for this is just a temporary setback in our lives. Mr. Speaker, as a member of this side of the House, my job is not simply to come here and criticize the budget because I'm on the opposition side of the House. My job, as every other MP sitting on the opposition side of the House, is to present the truth about this budget to the Guyanese people. My job is to remove the technical language that the government used to confuse and mislead the population and to simplify the budget so that everyone can understand what they can benefit from and, more importantly, what they will be paying for and not reaping a single benefit from, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the nation endured almost 5 hours of the senior minister within the office of the president with responsibility for finance, right? Present a budget that was laced with 60% political gaffe that meant absolutely nothing to the Guyanese people, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, it was imperative that I had addressed that and all that I just addressed. Since the government ministers who were supposed to be defending their budget came and spoke little to nothing on the budget and rather made it out to be one that got a stamp of approval from the Guyanese people and spoke at length about democracy and constitutionality, I simply could not have left such utterances unanswered, Mr. Speaker. Going back to the budget now, Mr. Speaker. The PPP named this budget a path to recovery, economic dynamism, and resilience. Strong words. What is economic dynamism, one might ask? The term economic dynamism refers to the rate and direction of change in an economy. This budget is struggling to meet the economic growth of 2019, Mr. Speaker. There is nothing dynamic about that. When looking at economic resilience, the concept contains 2 main components. One being resilience of an economy to observe an economic shock, and the other being the ability of an economy to adapt to changing circumstances and strengthen their ability to respond to potential future shocks, Mr. Speaker. And as all concepts in economics, there is a micro and macro concept attached to that. One aspect looks at how policies affect households, that is the micro concept, and the other looks at how policies projected holistically affects the country, Mr. Speaker. When looking to create economic resilience, one of the key aspects is household financial security. When we talk about resilience, Mr. Speaker, we want to make sure that Guyanese, the simple families, your neighbor, your cousin, your uncle, your auntie, they will be able to withstand the pressures of the economy, Mr. Speaker. That is the resilience that we should be speaking about. Mr. Speaker, we see this government, by their own admission, firing public servants daily. Is that how they intend to achieve economic resilience, Mr. Speaker? Is that the process by which they are using to achieve economic resilience so that to make sure that households are financially stable, Mr. Speaker? They are firing them to make sure that they are resilient. It doesn't make sense. Mr. Speaker, the members of the government, don't shout at me, sir. You with your 1CXC subject, don't shout at me. Mr. Speaker, the members of government,
Honorable Member, again I direct you to speak to me. Should I strike that out or you'll ask that it be withdrawn?
I'm so guided, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Speaker, the members of the government, day after day, MP after MP, stands in this house and speak on everything except their budget. It is as though they do not believe in it themselves, Mr. Speaker. And when they do speak of their plans in this budget, Mr. Speaker, they say things like what the Honorable Member, Mr. Mahadio, said last Monday. Mr. Speaker, on Monday,
Honorable Member Mr. Duncan.
Mrs. May I continue? Thank you, sir. Mr. Speaker, on Monday, Honorable Mahadio stood in this house and said, and I quote, "For the first time, there is a rehab therapist attached to the Bartica Hospital in Region 7, end of quote. Mr. Speaker, I implore that the honorable member stop doing whatever he's doing in his spare time and actually do some research, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, under the 23 years of the PPP's rule in Bartica, the Bartica Hospital was neglected. The 23 years that they governed this country, the Bartica Hospital was neglected. Hundreds of people died for the lack of basic health care in Bartica. It was under the APN UAFC coalition, Mr. Speaker, that the Bartica Hospital was upgraded to a regional hospital. Those are the facts. They are not debatable. You don't come to the House and debate facts. That is the fact. Mr. Speaker, when the APN UAFC took office in 2015, there were 3 doctors at the Bartica Hospital. The hospital that serviced numerous other communities, Mr. Speaker, in Region 7, and some from Region 10, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the facility was so run down that there was not a functioning theater to perform basic surgeries. Pregnant mothers in labor used to be put in a speed boat. I want you to pay attention to this fact, Mr. Speaker. Because when we come here and we speak to this house and we speak of the budget, sometimes we miss the concept that the decisions that we make affect real people, the real lives of people, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, pregnant mothers under the PPP's 23 years of rule in Bartica used to be put in a speedboat with a 75 engine and covered up with a plastic and sent from Bartica to Parika to get the ambulance to Georgetown while they were in labor, Mr. Speaker, because the Bartica Hospital did not have the capacity to deal with any form of complication whatsoever, Mr. Speaker. Mothers died, Mr. Speaker. Babies died, Mr. Speaker. Bartica wept for its daughters under the PPPC administration, Mr. Speaker. This is the fact. The honorable member is asking how come I did not die. And I can tell you this, Mr. Speaker. I can tell you this. Many times we come to this house, many times, and we speak of matters that we heard about. Many times we come to this house and someone would have told us through the grapevine, this is what happened. I was one of the lucky mothers. I was one of those mothers.
Honorable Member, your luck seems to be running still. Could we get someone to move an extension?
Thank you. Correct Speaker, I do move that the honourable member be given 5 minutes to conclude our excellent presentation.
Thank you, Honorable Member. Mr. Jones, Honorable Member, you may continue to conclude.
Thank you, sir. It was under the APN UAFC administration that the Bartica Hospital got a well-equipped river ambulance that patients could have traveled in comfort, Mr. Speaker. Persons can go and check the record. It's all over, Mr. Speaker. So for the honorable member, Mr. Mahadio, to commend the budget to this house that adds a rehab therapist to a fully functioning hospital they met in August 2020 is a damn shame. The honorable member cannot come to this house and speak as though the PPP cares to Bartica, Mr. Speaker. It appears as though the honorable member, he was in this slumber and he has suddenly woken up and he said, oh my God, There's this place called Bartica, and oh my God, they have a hospital. You know what? Maybe I should mention something in my speech, to take up some words, Mr. Speaker. This is not going to be tolerated by the people of Bartica and by extension, the people of this country, Mr. Speaker. It would have been remiss of me not to correct the perception that he attempted to paint to the rest of Guyana, Mr. Speaker, because he can never take that statement to Bartica. Never, absolutely not, could he ever take that statement to any resident of Bartica, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I can go further, and I think I must make this final point. It was under the PPPC administration, again looking at the Ministry of Health in Bartica, because we are talking about persons' lives, Mr. Speaker. It was under the PPP administration that the little boy fell down and he broke his arm, Mr. Speaker. He fell down and broke his arm, and when he went to the hospital, he was given painkillers and he was asked to go home. Within the matter of days under the PPPC administration, that little boy had a swollen arm and he was asked to go back to the hospital. The doctors had to send him to Georgetown because only emergency cases they could have afforded to send to Georgetown, and the doctors sent him to Georgetown. And when he got, you know why, Mr. Speaker? Because the Bartica Hospital did not even have a simple functioning X-ray machine, Mr. Speaker. That is the legacy of the PPPC, Mr. Speaker. When that little boy got to Georgetown, when that little child got to Georgetown at 7 years old, Mr. Speaker, his arms had already started to heal back in the wrong place, and the doctors had to literally hold him down and re-broke the arm so that they can fix it in place, Mr. Speaker. This is the horror that Guyanese and Barticians experience under the PPPC administration, Mr. Speaker. It was under the APNUAFC coalition that 20 doctors were placed at the Bartica Hospital. Several specialists included. The theater was working, Mr. Speaker. The X-ray department was working. Fully functioning ICU. Mr. Speaker, CT scans was put in at the Bartica Hospital. Surgeries were being done at the Bartica Hospital, Mr. Speaker. How dare the honorable member, Mr. Bahadio, come to this house and speak of the Bartica Hospital as though they met it in a deplorable state. Shameful, and it will not be tolerated. Mr. Speaker, I open today by quoting Joe Biden, who said, "Don't tell me what you value. Show me a budget, and I will tell you what you value." The PPP members stood here day after day and member after member, and they told us what they valued, Mr. Speaker. They told us what they value. But then, Mr. Speaker, they showed us their budget. And now we are telling them what they value, Mr. Speaker. And they place little to no value on the people of this country, Mr. Speaker. All they have done absolutely nothing to lower the cost of living for Guyanese. But instead, Mr. Speaker, they have added the largest debt burden on the working class that we have, largest that we have ever seen before, Mr. Speaker. That is budget 2021 for you. Without the technical jargons, without the niceties that the Honorable Minister presented in this House, this is what budget 2021 presents to the Guyanese people. I close by saying once again, Mr. Speaker, as I said in my budget presentation last year, trickle-down economics is a myth. It does not work. If there is no direct transfer to the working class, there will never be any transfer to them except for the burden of the budget deficit. If the PPP cares about the working class in this country, they would heed the call of the coalition and give the public servants a 10% retroactive bonus that we have been asking for. For that is the only right thing to do, Mr. Speaker. That is the only way that the PPP can redeem themselves from this atrocity of the budget that they presented in this House, Mr. Speaker. I thank you, sir.